Hi guys, welcome to our second coffee and chat, a really informal way of looking at a problem area for the week. We've made a decision within ELS that actually we're not going to formalize these types of things. There are too many formal productions of this type. So this is very much a grab a coffee and have a chat. Today is also biscuit day, so I don't have my biscuits, but I did have my bourbons earlier. Mark's instantly saying I need my biscuit. So if you've got a biscuit as well, that's a real positive, because obviously a drink is way too wet without one. So today we're talking about Black Swan thinking from the good old Black Swan book. I can never get it online, by a gentleman called Taleb. Really readable book. He uses story constantly in books. I have discovered that actually I learn by story far more than anything else. And as I was saying to Rob and Mark, one of the things that I found really interesting was just before lockdown, I was delivering a piece of training to a bunch of commercial officers from one of the public sector organisations we work with. And this area of discussion is one of our topics on that particular course. And I brought up Black Swan thinking alongside other risk topics and explained what a Black Swan was, which I'm going to do again in a moment, and then said, so what are you going to do about it, guys? Because there's a pandemic that's coming. And they all went and rushed back to their offices to do loads of stuff, really hoping they managed to do it because lockdown was the following week. But they did realise that they had quite a lot of catch up to do. So I think there are things you can do, and I think that that's one of the things that we'll discuss in this case. So what is Black Swan thinking? Well, Taleb, who is an absolutely brilliant writer, I think, it's a very readable book, came up with the concept of Black Swan. He called it Black Swans because he said that that in the 1600s, people had never seen a black swan before. They'd only seen white swans. So the first time they saw a black swan when they went to Australia and New Zealand, it had a huge impact. So the probability of seeing a black swan was zero, very, very low. The impact was very, very high. Well, people always say to me, well, okay, Kath, probability times impact. If you go probability is 0, impact is 5, then it's not going to appear on a risk register. So why would you bother with it? There are, however, a huge number of black swan events that have happened in the world, and some of those are going to lead to opportunity. Some of the more famous ones that we often use in examples are, and some of you will remember this, Rob, you'll definitely remember it. Mark's way too young, so he won't.
Thank you.
There was a gentleman called Gerald Ratner, who went and gave a talk at the Institute of Directors some years ago. And when he was preparing his talk, he gave this talk to his other directors and said, what do you think? And one of his directors came in and said, well, it's all right, but there's no joke in it. So he inserted a joke. And the joke he inserted was, he was talking about a decanter, and he was talking about the fact that this decanter was absolute, I think his phrase is, I sell absolute crap. And overnight, his share price fell and all of his shops just disappeared. So the probability of anybody saying, I sell crap, is very, very low, or at least it should be. The impact in his particular case was massive. And then people always say to me, well, yeah, Kath, but that's an example. Nobody else would do that. Really? Okay. So American Airlines, a few years ago, American Airlines decided to overbook their flights. And they decided it was a really, really good idea to put 2 security guards onto the flight and drag physically a guy from his seat down the gangplank with everybody else on their mobile phones recording what was going on, which of course went live. And yet again, probability, nobody would do that. You'd do it in a far more subtle way. You would definitely not do that. Probability very low, impact huge. Actually, impact wasn't so huge for American Airlines because for some unknown reason, we're prepared to be treated not very well in airlines and we'll still carry on flying. But, that's the concept, probability versus impact. We're in the middle of a pandemic at the moment. People say, is that a black swan? Well, what do you think? What do you think of his concept of black swan thinking? Is it something that we should be doing about something about from a risk perspective? What do you think, Mark?
Yeah, I definitely think so. The fact that it is a black swan means that at some level it has been identified, right? And if it's been identified, then it should be able to be mitigated against. Yeah, which is where we start to get into things like the contingency planning. You know, I haven't worked for an organization in the last 20 years who doesn't test its fire alarm system at least once a month, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, from a procurement background, why wouldn't we test our supply chain in our business? You know, it's critical to what we do. There are very, very few organizations who could actually survive purely on their own. There is a level of supply chain somewhere in there, yeah, a level of value chain in there. And black swan events seemingly are becoming more often. We look at natural events like tsunamis. We look at procurement decisions like the Grenfell Towers. We look at the pandemic today. You know, the awareness of these things should be being increased. And something that kind of strikes me about it, and I'd be really interested to hear Rob's thoughts on this, is whether is the challenge of black swans in part down to the culture of organizations. So what I tend to see is my manager only wants to see my top 5 risks, and he sees the top 5 risks from all the teams. What his manager sees are the top 5 from all the top 5 and the top 5 top, and it just goes up because the manager doesn't want to see all of these potential risks that could happen. Whereas actually these black swans should be written about in the contingency plans of the business and the business resilience plans. Does that make sense?
What do you think, Rob?
It's interesting, Mark, because I'll go back because my background is policing, as you know, Kath. So yeah. I left policing 6 years ago, but I remember 15 years ago, we were business continuity planning with pandemic flu on the very top of the risk register. That wasn't just our risk register, that was the national UK government risk register. And they had it high, so they had it as a higher probability than where it was in the last kind of year. So what's made it drop down, I don't know. So that's an interesting factor on its own. But I go along with what Mark's saying here. You know, we have to one, take cognizance of it, the fact that it's there, and we did, because we did top 20 risks, funny enough, and we kept those top 20 spread throughout the organisation. So it wasn't just held at a strategic level. We put those top 20 at every single level of the organisation and said, how does this impact on your part of the business, and what are you doing to mitigate against it in terms of embedded mitigation and then obviously planned mitigation. So we had mitigation split into 2, embedded plus planned. So the whole thing about pandemic flu, so when I obviously see this come up in the last 3 months, I'm thinking, oh, well, policing's already ready for this, government's already ready for this, and what's happened? It's absolutely not prepared at all. So the question for me is why?
Well, I think you're right, though, because it is on the National Risk Register. Pandemics are on the National Risk Register. And Taylor talks at the very beginning of his book about the fact that it's one of those really difficult areas, because if you mitigate fully, i.e. you spend a huge amount of money on PPE, for example, at the moment, and it doesn't come along, then you're criticised for all of that additional expenditure you've just made. You know, year 2000, we almost had, we thought we were going to have a black swan event then, didn't we? We thought all the computers were going to go down. And so we spent thousands on computer experts. And maybe that was the right decision to make, because those thousands we spent on computer experts, one of which was my cousin, maybe that's the thing that stopped the black swan happening. So the mitigation worked, but nobody gets praised for the spend. They get criticised for the lack of spend if you go into a risk position. So Taylor talks a lot about, look, it's when it's an opportunity for a black swan that there are far more advantages than if it's a risk black swan. I don't know I mean, you know, is there any way that politicians, businesses can actually work that one through without it being a major problem?
Quick question. We've got people wanting to join in. Are you happy for me to add panelists?
Oh yes, please. We like more people. Do you want to take off the PowerPoint as well, and then we can probably see more people as well?
I think that it should show up around, but let me
Okay.
Sure.
Well, we're gonna carry on talking, and hopefully they'll come in. We'll let you. There you go.
I think Rob made a really interesting point there, which I think is absolutely vital. In that the plan was made, people know what we should be doing in such an event, and obviously my bias is towards procurement. If you have a contract, you have clauses in there, you have force majeure, etc. You have a contract management plan. So all of these steps and mitigative action should already be in place. That's the point of terms and conditions, isn't it? If something goes wrong, then we know what we're going to do. So I think there's another piece in there about communication, because it's absolutely pointless having the contingency plan sat in a filing cabinet in the Met Office or in the commercial officer's desk if that's not shared and communicated. So, if they were communicated, how much could be mitigated just through that action?
Yeah. Hi, Brian. I know this. I was saying earlier that Brian's not necessarily going to agree with me on this one.
No.
Can't hear you, but we can see you. Looking good. Sign language.
I can't unmute you.
I think you probably hear me now, though.
There you go. Yep.
Yes.
All right, cool. Yeah, good. Happy days.
Yeah, absolutely right, Mark. I think that coming from a policing background, I think that was a kind of natural thing that we would do. We would practice it, we would exercise it, we would have things in place for it. I always remember the pandemic at the time. We were talking bird flu, and we were talking losing 50% of staff. So we planned everything on 50% loss of staff, not temporary. We're talking full-time loss. So how do we carry on with our business? And obviously some of our business in the Ministry of Defence is looking after nuclear assets, looking after military assets, all that kind of stuff. How do you do that with 50% of your staff? But we planned it, we exercised it, we did tabletops, we did all that kind of stuff. And we did lessons learned. This is the other thing for me. This is a really big one for me. So we do all this exercising. We have this lessons learned folder. Where has that gone? And I know this happened post my time in MOD now. 3 years ago, apparently they had this kind of pandemic scaled exercise at government level, at COBRA level, and there were lots of recommendations coming out of that, lots of lessons learned. What happened to those? Sat on a virtual shelf, and nobody took forward those actions, which might not have meant spend, but at least plan, exercise. And that for me is one of my biggies, this whole thing about, lessons learned.
So I think that, two big things coming out there. Mark, you're saying, get it written down, make sure that you're looking at it routinely. Rob, you're saying exercise it routinely. I don't think it matters whether it's at the geo level or it's at the tactical level. You still need to exercise it routinely. Brian, I know you've got some really definitive thinking on this as well. What's your...
No, I'm sure it hasn't. I'm sure it's not. I was just listening to the discussion though. If we or organisations are doing what you've suggested, the event is then no longer a black swan. Because,
exactly.
There are three. There are the three things that Tal have talked about. A, it's a surprise. A, it has a major effect, or has significant impact, and then afterwards, we try to rationalise it and say, well, actually, we, as you've said, as people have said, we exercised it. We should have been able to predict it with this or that, and the other. So, if something's and I caught your discussion when I first joined about whether something's on a risk register and you're measuring the probability and the impact, then how can it be a black swan if it's on there? If you go back to the doctrinal underpinnings of what he talked about in the book.
I mean, he does also talk in his early chapters about the fact that on occasions we overthink things. He talks about the difference between his uncle, who was in the government in Lebanon, and his uncle's driver, who, when asked exactly the same question, would say, I don't know. God does, I don't know. And both of them were probably right with regards to black swans, which is an interesting concept. He rationalizes the overthinking as not useful. But his big theme, I think his big theme within the book is to to say, okay, if we can't do too much about negative, i.e. risks, why can't we do more about opportunities? Because, looking at opportunity, that might be innovation, etc. That might be the push that actually says this is worthwhile looking at. And Mark, you and I have discussed previously, yes, everything changed. You and I have discussed previously the fact that, that a risk register, you were talking about the top 5, it could be that tsunami of stuff underneath, the iceberg of stuff underneath. If you added all of those risks up, they have far more value than just the top 5 risks. That actually one of our challenges always in risk management is that we manage by exception, but we tend to only manage through a spreadsheet and only the top 10, top 5. And that in itself is a challenge. But I don't see that many risk managers, and Rob, maybe you disagree, but I don't see too many risk managers focusing in on opportunity. We call it a risk register. It should have opportunity in it as well, but we nearly always just focus in on the risk. I don't know what you think there.
It's radar, isn't it?
I think this is where the lessons learned thing comes in, though, Kath, in terms of doing the exercise, whether it's a tabletop, whether it's a field X, whatever it might be. I think the opportunity for me comes out of that. But it's interesting, just looking at COVID-19 as the example here, look at the things like Formula One, stuff that's happened in Formula One because of, what was it, the masks that they use in the cars for the oxygen. Guess what? That's very readily cross-transferable. So there's an opportunity from industry. That's just one. I'm sure there's many examples here, but that's just one opportunity that's come out of this. That's something that everybody thinks costs, and it does cost millions and millions to run Formula One events. But guess what? They are at the high end of tech, and the high end of tech has actually benefited people's lives. Bottom line is people's lives has benefited.
And in our world, in learning and development, it's the whole of my career. People have been talking about education technology and the fact that we ought to use more of it. And all of a sudden, guess what? It's perfectly possible, because everybody's been saying up till now, oh no, you can't do that. No, it'll never work. No. But guess what? It does. It might not be as optimal in every case, but it does seem to be working. So sometimes, I wouldn't encourage anybody to be thinking a pandemic would be the perfect, but sometimes opportunity does come out of a black swan risk. And I think you've just explained that with regards to both the racing and indeed, what's going on in my world in innovation in that space. But what do businesses, businesses can, if they're very big, impact on what government are doing, but what do businesses do that actually move this forward? Because actually that's, really you have risk managers in businesses. So if we think that Taleb had a point, accepting what Brian's saying, that you might not even be able to put it on a risk register, but if you have this concept that he might have a point, what do businesses do in order to make sure that they are thinking this one through?
Well, I think
that's what they do, Kath. That they think it through. They think to the finish, and that what in my experience, people put things on a risk register, and as you said, tick, it's done. But actually, and what Rob's alluded to, what one must do, I think, is you war game it, you exercise it. You've got to think. Use Allenby's phrase. You've got to think to the finish, because no one could have. This is COVID-19 it's probably the closest example to a black swan that we're going to see in the other effects that it's had outside it being an illness. That's what risk managers could do. That's what business could do, is genuinely think to the finish. And then you also get the opportunity, as Rob's alluded to, you can identify opportunities. Not that you want to make, not necessarily want to make $1 out of a crisis, but there are opportunities, and whether that's an altruistic opportunity or a profitable one. The key is business has got to really think to the finish. Second, third, fourth order effects.
I think for me, a case study of Dunlop comes to my mind with this, about the business really understanding what it does. So back when it first started, we know Dunlop the tires, and I realized that its core strength was in manufacturing rubbered shapes, and so it could switch its focus onto Wellington boots, etc. And that enabled it to survive during a very difficult time for that company.
Yeah.
So, you know, as a training organization, do you deliver classroom-based training, or do you help to educate in a vocational sense? It's a slightly different shift, but in that risk register, if you go back to the core of what your business really does and the value that it provides, then I think it allows you to do this latest buzzword, which is pivot in that situation and continue. So
almost you're talking value stream mapping. So you know, there's another cracking example of a gentleman who's he's doing vertical farming. I'd never come across vertical farming until recently, but instead of having a proper farm, he's got a building that has, you know, various layers of farm. But actually, the way he's making his money is not in the vertical farm, but he's realized that actually the problem is the distribution piece. So he's now brought a distribution piece into his business, itself, that's sat right next to each of his vertical farms, and it's the pickers in the logistics that actually has become his money maker. You know, and you and I have discussed Philips on a number of occasions that they did something very similar. It no longer is light just being sold by light bulbs. It's now an experience, or, you know, it can affect mood, it can affect color. It's not just, you know, go to B&Q and buy a light bulb. So it's understanding, you know, that opportunity that says, look, what do we really do? And has something changed, which I think is where you're coming from, Brian. Has something changed thinking through to that end position? You know, I was talking to somebody yesterday that was saying, oh, well, you know, the military can carry on doing military aid to the civil powers, you know, carry on doing inoculation and etc. Well, can they forever? Because that's not what we've got the military for. I mean, I appreciate they're good at it and they can do it for the short term, but, you know, it's thinking to the end that actually is probably where we need to be. So I think we've come up with 3 areas now, haven't we? So we said, don't manage by spreadsheets. We said, practice it. We've said, give it some real thought and get to the end position. All 3 things I think the businesses can do. Any other thinking in the same space? God, I'm silenced.
Yeah, no, the other bit for me is about businesses should join up together as well. So I think a lot of businesses and government as well, that silo effect that we have to fix our own problem. I've been working with a few businesses who, along their supplier chain or through their customer chain, they've actually been co-joined in their thinking about how to address some of these risks and some of these opportunities as well. So come away from the isolationist type of thinking, you know, really spread it out and bring everybody in a kind of harmony kind of thing, and then take it forward as a collective. And it's interesting, what's the end game? Is it to save lives, as it is for now? Yeah, I don't think it's about making money at all. I think the other bit maybe it's about is actually getting your organization a really good reputation. So I might not be doing what I normally do. I'm not making widgets anymore. I'm making Wellington boots. But guess what? I'm not getting any money for it. But my company's reputation, in terms of the assistance we're giving to the NHS or whoever it might be, there's that branding thing. And we know you told the story at the very beginning about Ratner. Well, Ratner, in one line, his company reputation went down the Swanee. So pardon the pun.
I absolutely agree. I mean, the government's been talking about, is it ISO 14001 for at least 5 years now.
Oh, 44001 collaborative behavior,
Yeah, sorry. So I absolutely agree with collaboration. I think the technology in blockchain contracting will hopefully assist that in the visibility of the value that each of the supply chain is providing. So I'm hoping it's going to get there. For me, I think it comes back to that culture of that human behavior holding it back still at the moment, that we don't quite trust our supply chain, that they're not going to try and get one over on us in the event that, you know, there is a black swan event and we're in a weakened position.
Yeah, trust has been mentioned an awful lot in the last couple, 48 hours, hasn't it? So and trust within a supply chain, I think, is probably also critical. And sometimes that comes out of behavioral pieces as well, I guess. But yeah, it's a real challenge. Yeah. So
do you think do people think this will perhaps draw the UK enterprise in on itself, for example, about supply chains? Because if a multinational, actually some, let's say, some medium-sized enterprises or a FTSE 250 company, if they've got a supply chain that is multinational and is affected by something like COVID, where their factories in Spain aren't working, and they can't get the parts, do you think it might draw UK PLC in on itself to perhaps reinvest inwardly to maintain the British prosperity agenda?
I mean, we have seen an example of that, haven't we? So there was that chip factory just beside the nuclear power plant that got wiped out during the tsunami. And apparently this particular chip, and I don't mean potato chips, I mean chips that go in computers. It was the only factory in the world that produces this particular chip, and this particular chip is found in every single car. Big supply chain problem. So, but we've got another issue here, and some of this is to do with what our own workforce will do. So, a very good friend of mine has been working on the Land Army over the last fortnight, weeding vegetable patches, and 10-hour days, minimum wage, very few breaks, and absolutely shattered. And there've been a lot of people on that have come from all sorts of backgrounds, mainly because it was only for a short period of time, so they were happy to do it. But we're apparently not very good at it. People are now flying people in because we're fairly rubbish at it, in fairness. And they can get other people to do it who are a little bit better than we are because we whinge about it too much. So, it's quite an interesting one, this concept of will we do more ourselves? I mean, some of that is going to be more back to customer choice, isn't it? The world is a smaller place, or is it?
It's just interesting, seeing opportunities that come out of the government at the moment. One of the things that has scored, or is an increasingly prevalent factor in scoring is supporting the UK prosperity agenda. So who are you teaming with? Yeah. Is it UK supply chain? How many SMEs are you bringing involved? All that sort of stuff. So
and corporate social responsibility, which links into it as well, which is let's bring in the NGOs, let's bring in, what are you doing as a business that's actually helping your community? It's probably a topic of a completely different discussion. Yeah. But well, guys, it's coming up to 12:30, and we've always said that this is just a chat, so it's only half an hour long. So we are going to bring ourselves to a close now. I'm really grateful that the three of you joined me. Thank you so much. If you haven't read Caleb's book and you're not particularly into reading, he's also on YouTube, but it is an exceptionally good read. He does it through story. He has a very interesting area. He's from Lebanon originally. It's a country that I'm desperate to visit. I was due to visit last year and didn't quite manage it. I'm still desperate to visit, having read his stories. So I think it's a good read. There is a counter book to it as well, Countering the Black Swan. I haven't read that one yet. Maybe that's another thing I ought to be thinking of over this lockdown period. But really good to see you all. Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully catch up soon. Take care now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great chat.
Cheers.
Thanks, everybody.